Welcome to Bellingham Voices. I'm Marie Marchand. On today's show, I am happy to welcome community leader Stephanie Kountouros. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
This is going to be super fun because, first of all, we haven't seen each other in a few years. And second of all, you were able to come on short notice, which I was really glad about because, as I told you, I was kind of flipping through my phone and then I was like, who would be good for a show? And I came upon you because you have a history of activism. You have a lot of different things going on in the community. So I'm really excited to be able to talk with you about things. So we first met quite a number of years ago, I think in 2005, and you were a master's in social work candidate at UW, right?
Yes.
And so you worked with me as an intern at the Peace and Justice Center and went on to Planned Parenthood and a lot of things. So catch us up. What have you been up to lately?
Well, it was really wonderful to be your intern, you particularly, because you were a super intern supervisor, but also most people in the social justice program or social work program were really doing direct service, meaning working in a hospital with head trauma people or working in DSHS with child protective services, very much direct services. And I had a broader perspective. I had the more macro perspective, and I really wanted to look at the way systems change. And the Peace and Justice Center was an excellent opportunity, and that's how we got to know each other. From then, my second practicum was to help form and then lead a grassroots organization, Whatcom for Obama, in 2007. And we completely worked on our own to build interest and get support and get ready for the caucuses that year, which that year was 2007. And I went from that to briefly running for state senate against Kevin Ranker, and I withdrew from that race when I got to know Kevin Ranker, and I'm really glad that he's still our state senator. And then I got hired at Planned Parenthood. Worked as a policy coordinator and then policy manager for 6 years at Planned Parenthood, and then went back to radio, and here I am now.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back a little bit to the caucus idea, because when I lived in Colorado, they have caucuses too, and it was so exciting, it was so democratic, it was so loud, and debating everything there, and I was a precinct committee officer, so it's just that kind of democratic involvement I know has been important to you. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, since you ask, I have to say there's a lot of frustration with caucuses, probably in Colorado, but definitely in Washington State. And I really understand, just to go down the weeds of that a little bit, I really understand how frustrating it is when more than 200 people show up and things get backed up, and the precinct committee officers only do this every 4 years, so they're maybe not as trained, and we're all volunteers. And it is, like you said, a raucous, noisy process. That being said, I am completely an advocate for the caucus process because we don't have town halls anymore. We don't talk to our neighbors. We're all in our phones, watching TV, listening to podcasts. And once every 4 years, it's a real opportunity for us to meet people in our neighborhood and not just decide on who our presidential candidate is, but have a real conversation about who we support, but why we support them, and then talk about issues that are important to our neighborhoods. Beyond that, there's an important aspect of caucuses that a lot of people don't think about, and that is moving up the ladder to be at the higher level as a delegate for the county convention, for the state convention, and of course the big national convention. So if we were in a primary, it would be very easy to check off your person and never think about it. But if you wanted to be a delegate, most people don't even know how to do that process. So a lot of times it falls to party people. The thing about the caucus is we spend a lot of time learning about each other and then making a concerted effort, especially in Washington State, to really select people that represent a diversity of who we are in Washington. And because of that, when it comes to the national conventions, Washington State has one of the most diverse representations in terms of our delegates. So I had to throw that out there. And your original question was, why is it important to me? I think this year especially, people are very concerned with how we can make a difference, where can we make a difference, and regardless of where you are politically, it's frustrating to not be able to have a hand in what's happening on the national level. And what we have, the opportunity that we have, is to make a difference in our communities. And that is one way to do it. There's a lot of people who are not politically connected. There's a lot of people who just don't have time to really ferret out all of the information. I remember our Congressman Rick Larson one time asking people who are complaining about the health care bill, well, have you read it? Well, it's hundreds of pages long. Who really has time? Maybe people in our community don't speak English as a first language. Are they going to have time to read a bill? So where do we get involved? The first place that we get involved is when it comes to voting. And then the rest of what I do for my life is when we're not voting.
What was it like to run for state senate?
Well, it was an eye-opening experience that I encourage everyone to do at some point, absolutely. I think what happened to me personally is that our current state senator was off having a baby. And so there were a couple of panels where all of the candidates were speaking, and I was very concerned that my issues were not being represented, especially as a social worker and somebody who cares about social justice issues. And so I jumped in, and then Kevin Ranker came back, and he actually does represent a lot of my issues. But I also ran a grassroots campaign, and what that means is that I didn't have paid staff, which everybody says is a big no-no, but it was a bunch of concerted volunteers. And just like had happened nationally with Obama, I had $5 and $10 donations and really ran a pretty strong campaign. There was a lot I didn't know. There's a lot I do differently. And it's certainly something that has helped me really admire every single person who runs for office. Even if I don't admire their politics, if you're a serious candidate and not a joke candidate, if you're an actual serious candidate and you're putting in the work and you're walking the doors and knocking on everybody's door and really reaching out to people and finding out what their issues are, you've got to admire the dedication of somebody who does that.
For sure. And like you're alluding to, it may not always make a change, a concrete change that's your ultimate goal, but it builds awareness in the community. Like some people who have run for U.S. president, they may not win, but they call us to a different part of ourselves, whether it's our heart or our mind, and they really get us passionate. And hopefully we can take that beyond the convention and beyond the vote to integrate that into our lives. When I was at the Peace and Justice Center, sometimes I would get frustrated because people maybe didn't get involved as much as I thought they should. And now I'm kind of on the other end of it. There's activist organizations calling me, and I've got a son, I've got a job, I've got all of these things going on. And for example, the wolves, I'll just bring the wolves in. I'm really against the culling and killing of the wolves in Washington State in the Cascades. And so sometimes the most I can do, other than being very emotional about it, is to write to Fish and Wildlife in an email and get an email back. But there's something about registering your feelings and your thoughts to try to transform the world. You never know when an email or a phone call could make a difference. So that's why I've always appreciated your activism, because it has those two goals of really wanting to change something and then also realizing the value of increasing awareness. So I wanted to move into your radio activism right now, because I think that's super exciting and super unique. And I've heard that you recently got an award, so maybe you could start with that. I'm curious about that.
I did get an award this year, the Paul D. Armand Citizen Journalism Award. I do want to just embroider a little bit on what you said about activism and change and frustration, though. I'm going to out myself as a vegan, and speaking of eye-opening experiences, it's really frustrating to have that awareness, like you did when you worked with peace work and anti-war work, that you start to feel so passionate and so concerned, and your heart is so full with suffering, and it's the same issue of suffering, your issue or my issue, and yet realizing that there is a certain inevitability, even when there are people who are absolutely peace warriors, so to speak, or people who are protesting every single Friday on the corner by the city hall. And it's very disheartening at first when you have an awakening to something and you want to change the world. The wolves, the same situation. For me, it's the pain and suffering that cows go through or chickens go through. And it's such a hard awakening to realize that you can't end that overnight. And so I think for me, it's revising my idea of what change means. And a lot of that, I think there's some generational aspects to that. I think that there are times when a lot of us in our 20s are like, we're going to change the world and we're going to lie down in the middle of the street until something happens and we're not getting up. And not that there isn't that passion for people who are more my age, but not to say that I'm more centrist necessarily, but I take small victories. And I think your example of the presidential candidates, I think with Obama and I think with Bernie Sanders, there was a lot of movement and people came back to politics with both of those candidates. And Obama won, and that went a certain way. And then actually a lot of people who had adamantly supported Obama became frustrated when he was actually president and he had to do presidential things that were not quite as extreme as people had wanted. Maybe Bernie Sanders would have had disappointed people had he become president. In any case, people see it as a huge loss. There are still Hillary people and Bernie Sanders people that are very bitter and continue to have the conversation, which I think is maybe not so productive. But the point is, here we are with our first local elections since that presidential election. 2 candidates came from being involved with Bernie Sanders and would never have thought of running before. Whether or not you support those candidates, it doesn't matter because it changes the dialogue. So that's another way where I think I would have been more frustrated if somebody that I supported didn't win, and now I'm seeing a broad picture. Now I'm seeing how the repercussions of every action have positive actions and positive repercussions that we might not see. So that leads to your question about the Citizen Journalism Award. So yes, I won in February, or I should say I was awarded the Paul D. Armand Citizen Journalist Award for a lot of journalism and activism that I've had in Whatcom County. Paul D. Armand was an amazing human being. He was part of the Human Rights Task Force, and he, way before anybody else was really doing this in our area, was a watchdog on hate groups in Bellingham and Whatcom County. And we'd had a cross burning in 1996 up in Linden. There is a professor who is a black man at Western who was harassed and threatened. His life was threatened. There were militia people walking down the streets of Bellingham. And Paul D. Armand started documenting and tracking and alerting national organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center. And if you look at their website, we do have some pretty active and pretty strong hate groups. So he helped found the Human Rights Task Force. He was a doggedly persistent person in finding out and alerting people to the truth. So after his death, this award was created in his honor. There have only been 4 recipients.
Oh my goodness, congratulations.
Thank you. And so let's see, Sandra Robbins, Wendy Harris, Riley Sweeney, and I'm the 4th person. And in my speech, I sort of, maybe not so humbly, compared myself to Barack Obama when he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I said, I don't know that I deserve this yet, because I feel like my work isn't done. And there's so much more to do in terms of community activism and citizen journalism. I had started off as a professional journalist years ago, and worked at the CBC, worked at KVOS before KVOS kind of went off the air, and even worked at KISM for a while as a rock news person. And then I had abandoned it to do my political career and work at Planned Parenthood. And I really missed it. But one of the things that I missed was when I worked at NPR and I worked in a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And having been involved in commercial radio and commercial television, I saw the differences, and not to demean commercial radio, commercial television, but they are conglomerating, as you well know. Our newspaper, the money for newspapers is drying up, therefore there are fewer staff. There used to be something like 30 people covering Washington State Legislature in Olympia. 30 reporters, I think there's 2. Mm-hmm. And there's fewer and fewer reporters. People are not turning to print as much. In the meantime, radio stations are sort of monopolizing, and there's a conglomerate, and so one shock jock in Ohio might be broadcast on 150 stations. So there's less and less local perspective and fewer voices. And just recently on K-Bay, which was our AM progressive talk station that Cascadia Radio Group had, K-Bay just switched formats to music. So Joe Tehan, who has been doing a Progressive Voices show for a long time, is not doing that anymore. That just recently happened. So I feel even more and more passionately that community radio is really where dialogues need to happen. Even with mainstream media that has local guests on, the perspectives of mainstream media tend to be a certain privilege group, a certain, whether it's people who are white, people who have money, people who have access to media. Maybe it's not single parents who have 3 or 4 children, or people who are desperately trying to find a job or housing. Mm-hmm. Community radio has the opportunity to really give access to a variety of perspectives that are not being heard. And even if a mainstream station, television or radio, interviews somebody about, for instance, the hunger strike that is happening in Tacoma with detainees who are in Tacoma without representation, their immigrant status is being questioned, and they don't have a lot of access to rights. But if a mainstream station interviews somebody on the ground, who's directing that interview? Yeah. So, and who's cutting and editing the interview? So what I seek to do, and what my aim to do, is to help support other people's voices, that they have control over the media themselves. That's why I am very honored to have this award, and yet feel like my work is just beginning.
What are the call letters for your current radio program, and then also maybe who you've had as guests recently?
Sure. So when I got back into radio, I was working with Makeshift and their former station, and then I got sort of invited to join KMRE, which is Spark Radio, at the Spark Museum of Electrical Invention. Great. The Spark Museum has been around for about 10 years, and their idea was to get a low-powered radio license, which means its area of broadcast is smaller than a mainstream station. And they were handed out to communities and nonprofits. So when the Spark Museum, back when they were the American Museum of Radio, their idea was to have a living historic radio station, like it was in the 30s and 40s, where they would play old-timey music and have some old-timey folks and shows like Groucho Marx. And they did that successfully for about 8 years. But that's a pretty limited audience. There's people who are diehard fans of music from the 30s and 40s. But you can only do that for so long. So they hired our general manager, Suzanne Blaze, And she came in, and her idea was to really turn the station around and make it more community focused. Not to lose the golden oldies, and we still have sections of broadcast, but to really increase community voices. So I'm talking about the museum and the station, and then I'll talk about my program. So when Suzanne came on, there were 2 people who were doing local shows. Now we have over 30 local shows. Wow. And our station, KMRE, 102.3 and KMRE.org, we have local shows that are music-based. We have a couple psychedelic shows. We have a Beatles show. We have some local jazz shows. We have public affairs shows like the long and renowned Speak Up, Speak Out that comes out of Mount Vernon, which I'm sure you're connected with.
Sure.
And Jill Bernstein does South Fork Law and talks about law issues, and she interviews elected officials. We have a show called Reprogram Your Health, which is really alternatives to health and everything from acupuncture to Reiki and what's going on in health alternatives. And because we're in the Spark Museum, we have a lot of science shows. We have the national show Big Picture Science, but we also have Spark Science, which is Regina DeGraff from Western Washington University talking about local science issues, and STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math programs for girls, and really bringing that focus out. So I love the wide-ranging community focus of our station. We also have a program from the Lummi Nation. Daryl Hilaire does Friends and Relatives with issues that are relevant to the Lummi Nation. And my show is called Cascadia News Now, and it is the only public affairs show that is live. So when somebody records a show, and there's plenty of shows on our station that are pre-recorded, they can mess up, they can stop and say, can I do this over? And, or maybe I didn't actually want that on the record. all of that kind of stuff. But with my show, it's an hour-long show, and whatever you say, man, that's going out.
I never want to be on that show.
But nobody's listening because it's community radio. That's what I tell everyone. But yeah, and so it's really exciting. The energy is really, really exciting. And it's me, Dave Willingham, and Tim Johnson that are hosting this show. Tim Johnson, people know very well as the editor for the Cascadia Weekly. He's been doing this for 3 decades now, and has, as I'm sure you know, he is always at city council meetings and county council meetings, and he is very in touch with what's happening in the political world of Whatcom County and Bellingham. Dave Willingham, who also has a national news show on our station, he is a brilliant political mind. He has been a campaign manager. He has organized both candidate campaigns and issues campaigns. He started Drinking Liberally in Bellingham, and which is a sort of social group for people who are on the progressive side that want to get together and have conversations. And he is really a wonk. He's an expert at running numbers in terms of who voted in what precinct and who's more likely to do well in which area of the county and why, and he gets really into the details about that, but he's also a legislative expert. So especially this year, the budget and the legislature in Olympia was kind of a roller coaster, and Dave was able to lead us through all of that. And I'm the person that tries to hold it all together. And I certainly come with my own background and my own agenda and issues, but I feel like my role is to take these 2 brilliant wonks and connect them with people who normally wouldn't care about politics, or who find the minute you start talking about the Hearst decision that I don't even want to understand the details of that. And so how do we unpack it and make it relevant to people and interesting to people and not kind of swamp people? But going back to what I said about media, there's fewer and fewer voices and fewer local perspectives. And my show may not be the greatest show in the world, but it's so important to me that we have people on from different backgrounds. We sent a citizen journalist to Tacoma to do a story on the hunger strike. We have had Russell Lindigan on our show before, and we're planning to do a show about the Red Line freeway protest from the perspective of the people who were protesting, which has been a pretty controversial issue. but it's important to me that we get perspectives that you're not going to hear anywhere else.
Freedom of the press is so important.
Freedom of every voice, yes, for sure.
Yes, exactly. I'm wondering, as we kind of come to a close, what's the future for Stephanie Kountouros? What kind of goals or ideas do you have maybe for next month, but also for 5 years out? Give us an idea of that.
Well, who knows where any of us will be in 5 years. I hope that we still have a monetary system. But providing that things go, that we're mostly okay in 5 years. Short term, I have loved having my own radio show. It's not the first show that I've done. I've been a radio host on and off since my 20s, and I really love the sound of my own voice, and that's great. But as I get older, you couldn't tell from the length of my answers.
You know what? I love the sound of your voice too, which is why 10 years ago I said, have you been a radio host? Yeah.
Right, exactly. I love doing my own show, but as I've been speaking to you about all of these issues, my own passion is really changing to encourage and help uplift other people's voices. That is becoming more and more urgent to me, as on a local and national level, we have, as I said, fewer perspectives, and I've got to give a plug if anybody's interested in being a journalist, in just being at a protest or a rally or a meeting and turning their phone on and recording audio. That's what we encourage. Citizen journalism means you are the eyewitness. You don't trust somebody who's being paid to be a reporter. You give your own perspective, and it's changing what media means. It's changing the perspective, just like the internet. We're not relying on Walter Cronkite. We're not relying on 2 or 3 voices. We are all sharing our voices, and we get a better perspective of the truth. So I encourage anybody to join us who wants to do that. And I really want to increase not just community programming at KMRE, but really seek to increase the perspectives. We're in a fearful place in this country. There have been studies that show that we have something like 6 fewer friends than we used to do in the 60s and 70s, just on average. And there's more reports of gun violence, there's more reports of terrorism, and people are wary, that plus people being in their phones. But what happens is we're siloed in our own little communities, and it's easy to be afraid of Muslims. It's easy to be afraid of immigrants. It's easy to be afraid of Native Americans taking our water, which is maybe their water to begin with, right? So to me, the very best way to overcome that is to hear each other. And maybe, for instance, there's a Squamish festival every year at the Lummi Nation, and maybe people who are not Lummi are like, well, I don't want to go out there. I don't know anybody. I'm going to feel stupid. I'm going to do something wrong. I'm just going to stand there. I'm going to feel like an idiot. But if you can listen to friends and relatives for a while, it's like anything. You get to know people. You get to hear Daryl Hilaire's voice. You get to feel a little more comfortable. If we can hear immigrant voices, if we can hear voices from our Muslim community, boy, we can start to grow together as opposed to growing apart.
That reminds me of Mother Teresa's quote, there is no peace because we have forgotten that we belong to one another. And going back, I wanted to try to remember one of my other favorite quotes related to something you were saying, and it's Elie Wiesel, and it's, there may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. And that quote so reminds me of you and everything you've contributed to our community. So
well, thank you so much.
It's been great having you, and just thanks for joining me. It's wonderful to see you again and to make that connection, and I hope we can stay connected.
Let's not wait years.
Okay, indeed. Thanks for joining us on Bellingham Voices. We'll see you next time, and take care.